Also announcing that the Department of Housing and Urban Development is providing immediate relief to renters and homeowners by suspending all foreclosures and evictions until the end of April. So we're working very closely with Dr. Ben Carson and everybody from HUD.
Well, welcome to The Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you with us. As you can see, Donald Trump made it seem like he was stopping all foreclosures and evictions. Well, he didn't do that and can't do that unless they are federally insured home loans or affect people in public housing, which has shrunk to almost nothing. White sheets are flying outside houses across the country as a symbol of resistance. People saying we won't pay the rent. The problems for working people, where half of us live paycheck to paycheck and spend too much of our money on rent, is that rent and housing issues are local. And historically, when you had a rent strike, like the ones I led many years ago as a tenant organizer, you put your money into escrow, fought the landlord, changed the local laws. Now what working people are facing is a much deeper dilemma. How do you build that movement? What should we tell the federal government that they must do? How do you fight that? Well, that's what we're going to wrestle with now with our guest, Brendan O'Connor, who wrote the article Rent is Due for the Jewish Current just a few days ago. He's also writing a book for a Haymarket about immigration, capitalism, and the far right. And Brendan, welcome to Real News. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you heard Trump, what he said. Let's talk about the mythology that they're creating about what they're actually doing and what people are facing on the ground here in our country.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the reasonable, my response is I'll believe it when I see it. I think that what's been interesting about a lot of Trump's and some sectors of the Republican Party's response to the coronavirus crisis is that they are sending signals that they are sensitive to these kinds of social needs and demands, and even gesturing towards making an effort to address them. But as ever, there's no reason to believe that is ever actually going to happen. Trump is historically is by his trade, he's a landlord and a slumlord at that. And so I don't think that there's any reason to take his word that he's going to look after the interests of tenants in this moment.
And his son-in-law is a slumlord right here where we broadcast from in Baltimore.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a family of slumlords trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. I mean, there are only 8 million federally backed mortgages in this country. I mean, and 43 million rental households, the vast majority of whom are not even covered by anything because as you write about, this is state by state, the laws are different, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And even what protections do exist for tenants in places like New York are really very limited and very circumscribed because the real estate developer lobbies and landlord lobbies have spent years, decades doing everything that they can to roll those protections back.
So talk a bit about some of the people you've talked to across the country, from the Philadelphia Tenants Union to Stomp Out Slumlords. We talk about them for a bit, the Ridgewood Tenants Union, and the differences that these struggles face and why it's so hard, it seems, to be able to build a national movement for rent strikes. I mean, I think they have to really get to the underbelly of this and why it's so hard to build this, why they're having such a hard time.
Sure. I mean, I think that the tenant organizing and housing organizing is really difficult work under the most favorable of circumstances, which we are not in right now, or really even before the coronavirus hit. People's housing and living situations are precarious, and there is a lot of fear that doing anything to disrupt their relationships with their landlords is going to result in retaliation and eviction. Building support for a rent strike, building a campaign around housing issues, whether that's targeting an individual landlord, targeting a bigger developer, or targeting state legislatures, is long, slow, difficult work. Where we are now, however, as you mentioned, is that all of a sudden there is an unprecedented number of people who this month and next month are simply not going to be able to pay rent, not as a matter of political choice or as a matter of struggle, but just as a matter of their material circumstances.
And when you, There's something really deeply missing in this conversation. It's missing between the Democrats, most of the Democrats in Congress, and the reality of what Trump said. As you wrote, 3.3 million people applied for unemployment. Many more are going to be unemployed before this is over. Let's take a couple of examples you raised, both in Queens and out in Washington State, and there are in North Carolina, in Durham, North Carolina. They're all very different what they have to face. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, talk about how different these struggles are, and what's being done to bring them together, if anything.
Well, what's being done to bring them together is I don't know that there's really anything that there is really anything yet. But as you say, all of them are really different, but also fundamentally the situation is the same. Is that people are living in unstable housing situations. The differences are the political terrain on which people have to organize. As I said, in New York, that their tenants in New York enjoy certain protections that don't exist in other places. For example, the right to organize at all. In New York, we can meet with our neighbors in public spaces and talk about shared grievances, and that is a protected activity. Whereas in a place even as ostensibly progressive as California, you can be evicted for that. The obstacles to organizing are very different and require different tactics and different strategies in different places, which is one of the things that makes building a movement around a singular national demand, for example, canceling rent all over the country, very difficult, even though ultimately canceling rent is what everybody needs right now.
So, this is two things I was shocked by. In California, there are no laws to protect tenants when they organize. That was pretty shocking that they're that far behind people on the East Coast, where tenants have been fighting for their rights and have made New York and other places in Baltimore pass certain laws that are that actually help renters when they're fighting collectively. That doesn't take place in California or Washington State, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So when you take those things and you fold those things in together, and this white sheet movement that seems to be taking place across the country that's kind of catching on. And they're not really, you can't have rent strikes because they don't have the money to put in escrow to fight the landlord with. Then what are people telling you about where they think this movement has to go? What are they describing to you as what has to happen?
Right. So I think that there are two different broad tendencies that have emerged among people who are involved in housing organizing in this moment. One is one advocates for a really rapid escalation and acceleration of the struggle, which is to say that because the crisis is already upon us and demands an immediate radical response, and so basically everyone should go on rent strike. The way that one of the organizers in Durham, California put it to me, I thought was a very succinct articulation of this, which is that, if some of us can't pay, all of us won't pay. And this is a really compelling articulation of solidarity, I think. The difficulty is, and this is what the more cautious-minded organizers that I've spoken to have pointed out, and that you alluded to, is that when you go on strike, whether it's a rent strike or a labor strike, what you are doing is withholding something that is of value to your landlord or your boss, in this case, your rent or your labor. If you don't have the money to pay rent, it's kind of hard to think through how withholding the threat to withhold it translates into leverage. But that's where the call for solidarity comes in, for the people who right now are still able to afford rent, to lend their leverage to protect the people who are not.
So we'll see how this rolls out with coronavirus and the pandemic, because as you write and other people have said, that one of the issues here is it's very difficult to organize when you have to organize virtually. When you organize tenants, it's door to door, knocking on doors, sitting in people's living rooms, bringing your brothers and sisters who are with the same landlord with you, sitting down to organize this rent strike to take on the landlords. But you can't do that now. So it makes it even more difficult to be able to organize and for the tenants to organize for their rights. I mean, that's what many people were telling you, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that is something that people who are involved in movements in social movements on all different fronts are grappling with right now and trying to think creatively and imaginatively about. And a lot of people are. But one of the obstacles is that even if you are able to get everybody, say onto the same email thread or into the same chat room or onto a video call meeting regularly, again, how do you translate that into leverage and into pressure? Because you can't necessarily march on your landlord or on your boss's office if we're all working from home, or occupy a state house. There are and not because the correct and good thing to do right now is to maintain distance from each other. And like that is ultimately what solidarity is calling for. And this is a very, very difficult situation for organizers to be in. And I think folks are putting a good faith effort into thinking, like I said, think creatively and trying to imagine ways around this. But ultimately, I think a lot of the work that's happening right now is also geared towards laying the groundwork and the foundation for what comes next, so that these movements can come out swinging, essentially, when these restrictions are lifted.
And let me just say that this is the beginning of this story. Brandon O'Connor wrote an incredibly good story here for the Jewish Currents, and we're really happy to have him on. And you should check this story out. It'll be linked to our conversation here today. You don't want to miss that story. But also over the course of the next weeks, as coronavirus kind of envelops this nation and we deal with this pandemic, I and my colleagues Kim Brown and Jessel Noor will be bringing you stories of tenants across the country who are fighting their landlords and fighting the state and fighting the city to say, we're not paying our rent until this is over, until we get back to work, or you guarantee our income. And so that's a national movement growing that he wrote about in this article. And we'll be talking to many people in that article and others over the coming days. Kim Brown will bring another story this week as well from some of those organizers, and as I will as well. So you want to stay tuned for that and keep tabs on what we're doing. And we can help connect you all so that tenants across the country can organize together to stop these slumlords and landlords from taking away our right to live. And Brandon O'Connor, I want to thank you first of all for the article you wrote. Looking forward to reading much more that you write for Jewish Currents and everywhere else. And thank you for being part of all this.
Thank you for having me on, Mark. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. And I'm Mark Steiner here of the Real News Network. Send us your stories about your rent struggles in your communities, what you're facing, what you're doing, so we can talk about those as well. So I'm Mark Steiner here of the Real News Network. Take care.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.